Hello, if you're with us already, thanks for joining us early. We'll be kicking off in a few minutes, so just sit tight. Hello, if you're with us already, thanks for joining early. We'll be starting in just a few minutes, so please sit tight. Thanks. Hello. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight for a special event with the Oxford Climate Society. I hope you're all safe and well during this difficult time. My name is Shobhan Deer. I'm the Vice President of Oxford Climate Society, and I'm a PhD student working to develop sustainable batteries to support renewables. For those who don't know, Oxford Climate Society is part of Oxford University, aiming to develop the next generation of informed climate leaders. In addition to our speaker events such as this, we also run education programs throughout the year, such as our School of Climate Change, where we give everyone an overview of climate change from the fundamental science to the solutions. And that's actually open to all, not just Oxford students. So if you're interested, the applications for our next one will open over summer. We also run the world's largest student-run climate journal, Anthroposphere, and we're currently working with Oxford University to develop net zero policies and to incorporate climate into the Oxford curriculum. So the theme of today's event is, what is the impact of the COVID-19 crisis on climate policy? COVID-19 has had a dramatic impact on the world, having resulted in over 500,000 deaths globally and having sparked the most severe economic crisis since the Great Depression. Given the pressure that governments are under to keep people safe and to recover the economy, what is the implications of this crisis on climate policy going forward, especially given we are not on track to stay below 1.5 or even 2 degrees of warming, beyond which the consequences of climate change become much more severe? So how will future climate negotiations be impacted by this crisis? And what are the most effective climate policies which are viable in this new political climate? And could any actually facilitate economic recovery? To provide insight into these questions, I'm delighted to be joined by Ms. Patricia Espinosa, the current Executive Secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, also known as UN Climate Change. UN Climate Change is the United Nations entity tasked with supporting the global response to climate change, and it is the parent treaty of the Paris Agreement, as well as being the organizer of the world's largest and most important climate negotiation session, the Conference of Parties, or COP. Ms. Espinosa has led UN Climate Change since 2016, and previously she served as Minister of Foreign Affairs in Mexico. Ms. Espinosa has over 30 years of experience at the highest levels of international relations, specializing in climate change, global governance, sustainable development, gender equality, and protection of human rights. So we're going to start this event with Ms. Espinosa giving a short speech with her thoughts on the topic, followed by some questions from myself before opening it up to questions from the audience. So if you have any questions for Ms. Espinosa, please write them in the live stream chat on the right-hand side. So thank you so very much, Ms. Espinosa, for joining us today. It's a great honor and a privilege to welcome you to this event. So now I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Chopin. Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. And let me start by saying that it really is a pleasure for me to be able to speak to you, this group dedicated to policy issues related to climate change. While we'll certainly talk about policy today, I do want to begin with some context on how the world continues to address climate change during these very difficult times and why it must. People throughout the world have been through a harrowing experience in the last few months because of COVID. The suffering is still widespread and the end is not yet in sight. We'd be forgiven if we were to imagine the future and see nothing but a bleak Dixonian task. It's really bad out there. As Secretary General Guterres recently said, if nations do not start pulling together, things will get worse. We'll reverse the incredible progress we've made in recent years to lessen extreme poverty and hunger. Access to vaccines will be reduced. Women and children, who always bear the burden of troubled times, will be even more vulnerable. But it doesn't have to be this way. It is completely within our power to, as one leader famously put it, embrace the better angels of our nature. Today, that means addressing our challenges together through multilateralism. While we know that COVID-19 presents the single largest challenge to humanity since World War, our anticipated recovery from it has opened a rare window of opportunity. An opportunity, if we have the willingness and fortitude to seize it, to build a clean, green, healthy, and climate-friendly future. I ask you to consider the possibility that far from standing at the edge of the apocalypse, we instead stand at the precipice of a transformational moment in human history, a moment future generations will identify as pivotal, one that moved us from one era to the next. I'm not asking that you hope that this will happen, only that you believe that it is possible. Because once we believe something is possible, we can act. And action is what transforms possibility into progress. Progress means the development of plans and policies. It means strengthening logistics and legislation. It means identifying foundations we already have and perfecting them rather than chasing the new and shiny. Action also means making choices. And we collectively face a big choice if we truly believe post-COVID-19 recovery can lead to a better future. Will we choose to go back to normal? The normal where global temperature rise is on pace to more than double by the end of this century? The normal where our oceans acidify at an alarming rate? The normal that makes deserts out of deforested land and overworked soil? Or will we choose to not build back better, as some say, but build forward to enact policies that promote green growth, protect biodiversity, embrace renewable energy, and more? Will we accept that transportation can be different? Construction, supply chains, production, this is the choice we face, the moment of decision for national leaders and businesses as they map out their post-recovery plans and discuss economic recovery. Some already say that it is too hard, too tough, too bad for the economy, that mapping out a more sustainable plan for the planet will take decades. My response is simple. We already have the plan. It's called the Paris Agreement, and it's one of the most successful multilateral agreements of modern times and a covenant of hope with the people of the world for a cleaner, greener, healthier, and more climate-friendly future. It's reinforced by the United Nations 2030 Agenda, which is a global plan to tackle some of the most pressing issues humanity currently faces. I'm invited to speak to many groups these days, and they all ask me the same thing. What new policies do we need to build a more climate-friendly future? And I tell them, we don't necessarily need new policies. We need nations to finish and enact the ones they already promised. With respect to climate change, the biggest policy task nations had heading into 2020 was to complete their national climate action plans, or NDCs. Under the Paris Agreement, each nation must submit a 5-year plan that outlines exactly how they will tackle climate change. They're due this year in 2020, and that deadline has not changed. Why are these so important? And why are we so inflexible with the timeline? 2 reasons. First, science tells us that the window of opportunity to address climate change will likely close in the next 5 years. So we need incredibly strong plans. By the next round of NDCs, we may be playing defense instead of offense. The second reason is the one I just mentioned. Nations can spell out some of their post-COVID-19 recovery plans and policies in these NDCs, not in the distant future, but in the next 6 months. And while each plan is different, many cover policies addressing not only emissions, but also issues related to forestry, land use, energy, transportation, and more. Influencing the shape and the scope of these national plans is the single most significant action you can take to shape climate policies, programs, and legislation for the next 5 years. Those national plans were but one of 3 main tasks we need to achieve from a climate change perspective in 2020. The 2 other challenges include getting nations to complete their unfinished work with respect to climate negotiations. Primary among that unfinished work is getting an agreement on how carbon markets will operate, a big part of the climate change picture. Nations made some progress at COP25, but we're simply not there yet. The third main challenge is to ensure nations, as well as businesses, investors, and civil society, continue raising their climate ambition. Alone, each of these three areas is significant. Coupled with a global pandemic, they are truly challenging. Yet, we have no other choice. Climate change has not stopped for COVID-19, but neither has the work of UN climate change. Perhaps you are wondering how this is possible, given that COP26 is delayed until next year in 2021. So let me assure you, we are busier than ever. Like you, we have simply changed the way we work. We've held substantive discussions in almost every topic area, including adaptation, finance, and capacity building. Recently, we held the June Momentum, a series of online events offering an opportunity for stakeholders to continue exchanging views and sharing information in areas such as mitigation, science, technology, transparency, gender, and more. We also launched our Race to Zero campaign. Its purpose is to mobilize leadership and support from businesses, cities, regions, and investors who are working to create a healthy, resilient, and zero emissions recovery, one that creates jobs, unlocks inclusive, sustainable growth, and reduces the risk of future shocks. The coalition driving these net zero emissions initiatives are setting interim targets in 2025 and 2030, and the response has been significant. We have seen other progress as well. 114 countries have already announced they will enhance their national climate plans, the ones I spoke about earlier, and 121 countries have committed to achieving carbon neutrality by 2050. We are also encouraged that the majority of climate and environment ministers in the EU back a call to put the European Green Deal at the heart of a post-COVID-19 recovery. We continue to encourage the EU to continue showing global leadership. Looking ahead, the Secretary General has proposed 6 climate-related actions to shape the COVID-19 recovery. First, as we spend huge amounts of money to recover from the virus, we must deliver new jobs and businesses through a clean, green transition. Second, where taxpayers' money is used to rescue businesses, it must be tied to achieving green jobs and sustainable growth. Third, fiscal firepower must drive a shift from the gray to green economy and make societies and people more resilient. Fourth, public funds should be used to invest in the future, not the past, and flow to sustainable sectors and projects that help the environment and the climate. Fossil fuel subsidies must end, and polluters must start paying for their pollution. Fifth, climate risks and opportunities must be incorporated into the financial system, as well as all aspects of public policy making and infrastructure. Sixth, we need to work together as an international community. The value of multilateralism in a global crisis is unmistakable. If we get it right, we can help steer the global recovery towards a more sustainable and inclusive path. Again, we must remind nations that they already have a framework for action, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Paris Climate Agreement. So, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, all of this is possible. We can build a better future, but we must first believe that it is possible and then act. I know it can be difficult to be motivated when everything seems so bad, but we must truly embrace the long view of history and recognize that some generations are given the opportunity to truly impact its trajectory. This opportunity has been given to your generation. So, what will you do with it? Are you ready? You have the plan, the Paris Agreement. You have a path, the 2030 Agenda. And while you have a short window of time, I know you have the initiative. Youth around the world have significantly changed the climate change debate in just 2 or 3 years. And we at UN Climate Change are ready to work with you to do all of this and to build a future that is clean, green, sustainable, and healthy for all. I look forward to our conversation, to your questions, and I look forward to continue working closely together with you. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Patricia, for such inspiring words. Thank you. That was amazing. I'll start with the questions then straight in. What basically what climate policies now, because of the impact of the coronavirus crisis, do you think might be strengthened or weakened? Are certain climate policies now more or less viable? And if you could, if possible, could you comment on regional specific differences?
Well, I think we are at a moment where we need to really understand and fully acknowledge that we need to work on very specific realities. There is not one recipe for everyone. However, of course, as I mentioned in my intervention, there are sectors that are relevant and that present areas of opportunity for different countries. In many countries, for instance, energy is one of those sectors, not only developed, but also developing countries. If we look at the people that are still deprived of electricity around the world, they are all in developing countries. If we look at the fact that the population growth will come mainly from developing countries, that means energy needs will be increasing in those countries. That means really energy needs to be seen as one of the areas where we need to make a big change. The same about transportation. We need to look at the public means of transportation and try to get to electric buses, electric trains, and we also need, however, we also need to look at where that electricity is coming from. So, we can identify some sectors that are really very important. Construction is another sector, land is another sector, but what is very relevant, I think, is to really look at the realities individually, see what are the areas of opportunity, and also realize that besides the specific areas of the economy that need to be changed, that we need to make a very important political work to make the changes happen. It's not, we may know what is the right thing to do, but then you really need to get decision makers in individual countries to get together, put their minds together, and really come forward. So it's not only, about the specifics of the policies and the sectors that need to be addressed. It is also how to make that happen in the individual realities. And this is, I really appreciate very much your work and your interest in looking at also the processes. I think we need to go one by one, and it's a lot, and it looks like a lot. But look, we have 196 parties to the convention. Okay, can we not address 196 realities? I think we can. I think the world has the capacity. So we should really put ourselves to that.
Thank you. Thanks so much. I'd ask then, because obviously then it will, as you say, depend on the country and it's very different, but what are some of the policies that maybe for a lot of countries or for the majority that you think would be important to be a part of green stimulus packages that would actually help facilitate economic recovery, because that's a big concern at the moment? And for those countries that have already announced green stimulus packages, such as Germany, how effective do you think they have been and their measures have been in addressing climate change so far?
Well, I think that, you know, some of the points that have been put forward by the Secretary General, I think that they really give very clear and very specific guidance. One of the things it has to do with, you know, job creation. We know that in order to overcome a crisis, we need to look at job creation, but we need to look at jobs that are closely linked to green and healthy societies. So, okay, we have normally seen in many past crises, construction sector has been one of the sectors that has helped in overcoming crisis, because they are very intensive in job creation. Okay, now what we need to do now is, yes, create jobs, but jobs that are closely related to green construction. If we are talking about infrastructure, we need to look at resilient infrastructure. How do you promote resilience in infrastructure? You cannot, or you should not, approve any projects that are not have not gone through an analysis of climate risk. Otherwise, well, you may be building a bridge or a road or something that will just only last for the next big disaster. The same about the existing housing sector, for instance. Okay, we know that there is an enormous task ahead of us to refurbish the homes and buildings that exist in cities around the world. That's a fantastic area to start. We need to get away from subsidizing fossil fuels. And in the energy sector, we're still seeing that there is too much more support for fossil fuels than for renewable sources. So this is an area that really we need to look at very carefully, and this is a reality that applies to developed and developing countries. And what is the important point here is, okay, if you are asking a country, please do not go further into fossil fuels, especially countries that have some resources. Okay, then we as an international community have the responsibility of bringing closer some alternatives. How can I have seen leaders from developing countries say, you know, my people are needing this energy. How can I not go in this direction if I have no alternative? And the Paris Agreement provides really a fantastic framework, because it establishes very clearly the obligation by the richer countries, the developed countries, to support this transition and this transformation in developing countries. So this is why I was also referring to what are we going to, what should we do in the future? Well, maybe we can start with really honoring the commitments that we have made already until now.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I guess I'll just go on to COP26, which you mentioned, and obviously it's been delayed by a year, but things are still happening in the background, as you mentioned a lot, and the national NDCs are going to be still submitted by the end of the year. But what now COP26 is a year on. What needs to be achieved now? It's going. Our next big negotiation session is a year later, and what is the ambition for COP26? Like what are you hoping to come out of that?
Well, as I mentioned, I made a lot of emphasis on the national plans, national climate plans, the NDCs. And I think this is very important because we were supposed to be assessing or looking at the NDCs this year. Now we won't have the conference, but we have to remember, and this is why I wanted to make this point, we have to remember that the deadline for submission of NDCs has not changed. That was adopted years ago. We cannot just suddenly change that. And especially not, even in these very difficult circumstances, especially not because we know what we're talking about is really human lives, is really talking about the future of humanity. So there's too much at stake. So I think that the NDCs really need to be delivered. I hope that we can have a good picture that will allow us going into COP26 to say, yes, we are making progress. We are on the right track. We still can make it. So I would say this is the first point. Then there are a few areas, important areas of work that need to be finalized regarding the rule book, the operating manual for the Paris Agreement. And one has to do with Article 6, which is carbon markets. And that's an important instrument that should allow not only developed countries, but also developing countries to attract some investment into their economies. And so that's a very important piece as well. Yes, the European Union has a carbon market and there are other carbon markets in different places of the world, but it is important that we build that capacity or that platform globally so that every country, even the smallest one that doesn't have the capacity to build its own carbon market, can benefit from this. And there are other pieces in the negotiations, like, for instance, regarding the transparency, the enhanced transparency framework, and how it should be working into the future. We are also starting a dialogue with civil society in order to try to make their participation in our process much more meaningful. I say very frequently that governments alone cannot do this transformation. We need everybody on board. And the truth is that we need to see how we can make a better cooperation between parties, between governments and all other actors, from private and from public sector, like regions, cities. We really need this to become the normal. Everybody just aware that every decision that they need to take has to go through the lens of climate change.
Thank you. So the NDCs being so important, how will we be able to incentivize countries to step up these NDCs and be more ambitious this year against the backdrop of the economic downturn?
Well, we are on the one side. I think it's important also to acknowledge that, and this is one of the points also I was making. Let's not talk about building back better. Let's talk about building forward. We need to build these new, inclusive, healthy, green, sustainable societies that takes care of these very delicate balance between humanity and nature. And we are really now experiencing in a very dramatic manner how much that can involve suffering and loss of lives and livelihoods everywhere. So I think we need to first of all acknowledge that we do not have an option. We cannot, if we want to speak about a recovery, if we want to look at a world, with a forward-looking vision, when we think about the youth like you, and how are you going to live in, what kind of world will you have in 20, 30 years to develop all your potentialities? So we need to be conscious that there is no choice. The choice of going towards those practices and policies and realities that brought us to where we are is not there. Some years ago, we were still saying, well, it's sustainability means a big burden and that not everyone can afford it. Today, what I say is nobody can afford to continue with the business as usual model. That's the only unsustainable path.
Thank you. I guess then I'll ask, what lessons should we take from the COVID-19 policy response for the climate change policy response? And are there some good lessons we can learn there?
Yes, indeed. There is always something positive that we can learn from this crisis, a big crisis like this. I think on the one side, COVID-19 is really the first global crisis that has hit every region, every country in the planet at the same time. If we look at other crises before, even global crises like the depression and the post-World War scenario, yes, in a way or another, everybody was hit, but not with this clarity, not with really, and everybody has been hit now personally in their everyday life. So I think this is, it's like a wakening call of, we've been talking about a global crisis, and now we know what a global crisis can look like. So, I mean, it's a difficult lesson, but it's also, we could look at it in a positive manner. The other one is to really realize that societies are able to change behaviors in a record time, that there is this capacity, that there is this creativity, and that people can be mobilized if they understand what is at stake, what are the risks for them. So, to see the pictures that we have been seeing over through the media of cities in so many different parts of the world, people wearing masks, people being locked down, it's amazing. I think that, in January, if you would have asked anybody, is that possible? Probably nobody would have said that's possible. and suddenly we saw it happen. So this kind of openness, we are seeing that people can adapt and to new realities and new requests. Why? Because it's in their own interest, and this is the same with our agenda. And then we have seen also a lot of solidarity, um, human nature at its best in so many places. Not always, but in so many places, you know. So I think that's also a very good lesson.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I guess to follow that, so now given that the public have shown all over the world such an ability to dramatically change their lifestyle with very little resistance in ways we couldn't have ever imagined before, do you think policies now which could address certain climate positive behaviors should be prioritized? Ones, for example, that were political no-go areas before, like such as encouraging people to eat less meat or to fly less. Do you think now politicians and governments should be looking at this?
I think so. I think so, and I certainly hope that they are, and that we can maintain this forward-looking view and this acknowledgement of the incredible capacity of society to adapt to new realities. I think this is. I mean. Probably get decision makers to listen more to what the people want and are able to do. Not only to those group of influencers, but you really to take a broader look of about what is really that people want. And this is probably also linked to a certain erosion of trust in institutions worldwide. So I think also in that sense, addressing this climate crisis in this post-COVID scenario is a good opportunity for institutions to rebuild trust and rebuild a space within societies.
Thank you. That's great. I'll ask my final question. Then is just that there appears to be a growing disconnect between the urgency demanded in this by the public and the science, and the pace of the climate negotiations. So, what are some of the key barriers that you see to progress in the negotiations, and how could the negotiations process be improved?
Yeah, well, frankly, this is an issue that worries me, and our initiative to try to open a space with the observer constituencies in our process and with other groups like we are doing today is really related to this. We need within the UN, we also need to open more our minds to listen to what is happening, to the demands of people around the world. And the youth have done really a wonderful job in a very short time over the last year, and now of course a lot of the activities are being held virtual, but we still need those voices, and we need to have more engagement. I would say it's important also to see that it's not necessarily only engagement during the conference, during the negotiations, but on an ongoing basis at national level with the decision makers, right? Who is in every country, who is responsible for defining the position of the country in these negotiations? Those decision makers need to be addressed. they need to listen to their own constituencies. We certainly feel that there is also a lot of goodwill and constructive willingness to engage. And I think this is something that, sometimes we see that civil society and governments are seen like in opposite places. Well, we need to become a team because it's about survival of humanity, and we will only make it if we work together.
Thank you so much. That's great. So there's been a lot of questions from the audience that I'll try and combine, asking how young people can get involved, and particularly since you mentioned we've got these 5 critical years to act, where young people don't have enough time to get into leadership positions. So what can they do in early career professionals? What would you say is the best advice for how they can have an impact?
Well, I would go to this last point that I was making, to be engaged with the decision makers at local level, at regional level, at national level. That's where you need to do it. Also to really participate in changing behaviors. Sometimes I think the youth, young people feel that they have very little power, right? But the truth is that young people can really help in changing behaviors. I can tell you many examples, but I think from my family, but I think in every family, if you have the youth coming to you and telling you, no, I don't want to eat meat every day, I want to eat meat only once a day, that's probably going to be very effective in changing the diet of the whole family, you know. And if you are going to, youth have 2 very, very powerful weapons, I would say. One is, or instruments rather than weapons. One is their vote. They vote. They decide who is going to be taking the decisions for them in the future. And the second is their purchasing power. They can decide, what am I going to buy today? How am I going to invest my money? Where is the bank where I have my money investing? Is this bank investing in fossil fuels? I mean, there are really these 2 instruments are extraordinarily powerful. And then if you add the voices, the voices of the youth, that's also very, very powerful. I have been in national government most of my life until I came to this position. So I know if you have a group of youth that is coming to you as a minister or as a parliamentarian, is asking you and requesting you to speak to them on A, B, and Z, you will probably very, very likely be successful in having this exchange with those decision makers. It is really very powerful.
Thank you. That's great to hear. So now there's been a question that governments are already bailing out corporations without green conditions. So is it enough to raise the carbon literacy of governments, or what changes must there be in corporate governance? Or what would you suggest, given that they are bailing out without green strings attached?
Yeah, well, the one of the points in the call by the Secretary General is that when governments are supporting businesses, they should be oriented. These resources should be oriented towards businesses that are that have goals that are aligned with the Paris Agreement, with resilience, sustainability, etc. So I think, and here I make again the point, normally if you have such a recovery package, you will have to take that to Congress normally, right? So you will find that at the end, it's not one person that takes a decision. At the end, really, it's a series of people that are involved in all of these decisions. So engaging with them, really asking them to not go that way. Why? Because they are accountable to you, to the youth, and to the to the regular citizens. Why would you want to give see that your money is being spent in a way that will, especially in the cases where you see it will lock the economy in not in a carbon in a low carbon trajectory. If you are investing in a coal-fired power plant, then you are locking that investment for the next X number of years, that it is not going to be logical. So this is a moment, and this is why it is so important that we do these conversations right now, which is when decisions are being taken.
Thank you. There's another one that's come in, so is asking to what extent can the UN intervene when there are violations of environmental laws around the world? And they give a prominent example being the degradation of the Niger Delta by many fossil fuel companies based in Nigeria.
Well, in the UN, most of the international treaties that are made under the UN are based on the conviction by parties who are part of those treaties that it is in their interest to support these rules. Why? Because in anarchy, everybody loses, right? So if we want to have a peaceful and stable environment globally, you really need to realize and accept that you will also need to follow certain rules. So basically, it's based on the conviction that it is in your interest to support these these rules in all different areas. There are only very specific cases where the UN can apply some formal sanctions, which go through the Security Council. But what is important here is that the non-compliance with some of those regulations have, at international level, do have a negative effect on the credibility of that country. And nationally, it serves those international commitments are frequently very useful in enacting legislation that allows to have some specific actions in cases of violations, right? So many countries, for instance, have environmental standards for any new construction projects, right? So anything that is going to be built, is proposed, needs to go through a certain procedure. And there are, in national laws, also some punitive measures that can be taken. But it's at the global level, the UNFCCC gives a global comprehensive framework.
Okay, thank you. Someone has suggested, would an international crime of ecocide or force more world leaders to comply with the Paris Agreement when non-compliance is causing devastation already? Do you think it could get to that stage?
Well, as I mentioned, this is not something that is contemplated either in the convention or in the Paris Agreement, you know. But it is. I mean, I think it's important to underline that it doesn't mean that there is no instruments. I mean, yes, out of that global framework, you get in most countries, national legislation that allows the society to follow or to have certain protection about the actions that are allowed and those that are not allowed. But I mean, I think we have to put our emphasis in the fact that here we are working towards this better world that everybody deserves and that we believe that every leader should be trying to promote.
Thank you. I guess there's one that's saying, do we have to change our economic model in order to solve climate change? Can we really hope that the current neoliberal economy can reduce emissions when the last 40 years have shown otherwise?
Well, I don't know whether I would want to speak about economic model, but I think that we are seeing not only on regarding climate change, but in many areas, right? Issues that need to be corrected, and this is a little bit what this is the core of the 2030 development agenda. We have seen the longest period in history where humanity made a consistent progress towards on health, on combating poverty, on gender, on multiple challenges. At the same time, we have also seen a period where the divide between those who have and the vulnerable ones, has been growing. So I think there are many indications of the need to really reassess how we want to move forward, away from a society that is based on endless extraction and use of resources, of very intense consumption. I think this is something that has become really very clear, and where we need solidarity, not because if you have the resources, you are going to help others, but because your own well-being also depends on the well-being of all those others.
Thank you. There's a question asking, so how is COVID-19 going to affect climate policy in the global south? And also, since there's been a capital flight from the northern countries, how can they continue with the energy transition? And how can developed nations support them going forward?
Well, you know, the issue of support to developing countries is really one of the big areas of work within the UNFCCC. And it is true that we are still not there in terms of support. I think that we, precisely because of this COVID-19, post-COVID-19 recovery plans, we have this opportunity to say, okay, not only am I going to take the case of some of the countries in Europe. Many of them, their economies depend largely or to a big extent on the business that they do abroad, right? That means it is in their interest also that those countries, those developing countries, recover, because otherwise, if their demand falls, then they are also in big trouble. So this realization that we are talking about a recovery that is necessary to support for everyone's interest is very important. Financial resources are still scarce, still for some countries, some developing countries are not yet accessible. I am, however, very encouraged to hear commitments and willingness by the financial institutions to include in a much more determined and robust way climate change as one of the elements of the recovery packages and their lending policies.
Thank you. That's great. I guess I'll make this the final question because I'm aware of time. Someone has asked what the elephant in the room, the climate talk seemed to be the US's withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, being the wealthiest country in the world and one of the biggest polluters. How can the UN climate change influence the US and try to get them back on board?
Well, you know, actually, since the decision to withdraw was announced, we have always maintained our very clear message in saying, you know, we are more than happy to work with you and address your concerns regarding the Paris Agreement. I cannot but say that it is really a source of concern to us, the departure of the UN, of the US. I certainly hope that we will be able to continue engaging with them. The US it stays as a party to the convention. So the US will continue to be part of our process. And I hope that we will be able to engage. In any case, on our side, the willingness will continue to be there in order to get them back on as part of the members of the Paris Agreement as well.
Thank you so much. Thank you for so many insights and interesting answers. I guess before we finish, I'd just ask, is there any final remarks you'd like to leave our viewers with? Yeah.
Yeah, well, maybe the message to you is really believe that this is possible, that the transformation is possible, that it is not a lost battle. And therefore, please continue to engage. Don't give up. Don't think that, you know, fossil fuels will be there forever and we can do nothing. And please just recognize that you are extraordinarily powerful in driving this transformation, and that this is really a big moment in history, and it can go very, very good. It can go very bad. So we all need to stand together in order to make sure it goes in the right direction.
Thank you very much. That was such inspirational words, and thank you so much for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure and an honor. So thank you, and thank you to everyone who's tuned in at home. This video will stay online, so you'll be able to go watch back and listen back, and especially share it if some people missed it. Thank you so much from on behalf
of Chopin. Thank you.
Thank you.
Have been really a pleasure. Thank you, Nathan. Thank you. Thanks to both of you.
Oh, thank you. And I'll say good night to everyone at home, and just follow us on Facebook or our website if you want to see what's going on. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Patricia. Thank you.
Thank you.